Hi, this is the second of our presentations for this week, and it also concerns the nature of war, albeit from a different angle of vision. Let me share the screen with you and show you today's presentation. Now, here is a list of key terms for this presentation, and for most presentations, I'll provide such a list, and many of the terms will appear on your quizzes and examinations. However, a number of broad concepts will not, although the presentation will make it obvious what they are. So, for example, in the last presentation, we were talking about the definition of war. And that concept is so broad that it would be pointless to put it up as a specific term. It applies much more widely than that. By the end of this lesson, you should understand, first, the nature of war before civilization. And we use the term war before civilization in preference to the outmoded term primitive war, because this suggests that persons living in the Neolithic era, and there are some people who to this day live in Neolithic conditions, are somehow less than civilized or somehow inferior to other human beings. And so we want to avoid that, that insinuation. And a way to do this is to talk about war before civilization as opposed to primitive war. Secondly, I'd like for you to understand, it's important to understand the basic unresolved question of whether human beings inherently engage in organized violence, or whether organized violence has an historic beginning, and if so, the possibility of a future end. And third, I want you to understand about the Hobbesian state of nature as a famous thought experiment in whether humans are inherently violent. A Hobbesian is an adjective form that goes back to Thomas Hobbes, and so it refers to the idea of this English philosopher, Thomas Hobbes. And as we're going to see, some of his views on a state of nature have a lot to do with this issue of war before civilization, and also, for that matter, by analogy, the idea of man in a state of nature as extrapolated to societies, to civilizations in a state of nature relative to one another. The origins of human society are a matter of educated guesswork. Broadly, we think that humans began as hunter-gatherers and shifted to settled agriculture, serious agriculture, around 10,000 years BCE, and that stands for before Common Era. This term used to be before Christ, but scholars have increasingly turned to the term BCE, before Common Era, as a way to use the present dating system of years without resorting to direct reference to the Christian tradition. And so insofar as possible, we'll try to adhere to that convention in these presentations. We know that warfare was a characteristic of the first major agriculturally based societies. We have some historical evidence to support that. That's really the beginning of history as we know it. But was it characteristic of earlier hunter-gatherer societies who lived in prehistoric times, and therefore our evidence base is much more limited? The physical evidence is certainly equivocal. Now, this presentation assumes the validity of the theory of evolution and the idea that present-day human beings, Homo sapiens, is the scientific term, evolved from precursor species called hominids. Homo erectus, which is the species shown here, was the first that we know of to use stone tools. This began about 600,000 years ago. Modern humans, by the way, emerged about 40,000 years ago. And initially, Homo erectus simply used stone chips, and gradually their tools became somewhat more sophisticated. They learned to create much sharper points and also to use spears. As with early humans, they were hunter-gatherers. They were organized into bands of several dozen persons, almost certainly members of extended families, and perhaps a few others adopted into the band. Let me back up here. They banded together for mutual protection, for the provision of food. Some members could actively hunt animals and gather fruits and vegetables, but while others, the very young or the very old, for instance, could not. And from surviving evidence, it is possible that they engaged in simple religious rituals. If there were motives for violent conflict, and I emphasize the term if, because if is at the heart of today's presentation. If there were motives for violent conflict, these would have been over food and water sources in times of drought, the forcible acquisition of sexual partners from other bands, and possibly what Native Americans would later call mourning wars. And what I mean is mourning in the sense of grieving, not mourning in the sense of the time of day. And these mourning wars, these grieving wars, occurred when a community suffered losses that jeopardized the viability of a group. These bands, these communities were so small that the loss of even a few members jeopardized the viability of the group as a whole. And so it was important to replenish lost members somehow. And this was done by, on the part of the Native Americans, by capturing and adopting into the community persons who were originally from other communities. There would have been, among these pre-human societies, no specialization of tasks, say perhaps in the care and rearing of younger children. There would have been communal living with little or no personal property. Leadership would probably have been based on consensus, so that essentially adult status was the only requisite for holding political or social power. And this was characteristic of the Old Stone Age, which in formal terms is called the Paleolithic Age. By the end of that age, as one anthropologist expresses it, the consensus view among other anthropologists is that the more advanced people customarily lived in shelters made of wood or hides or sod or bones, that they dressed in clothing sewn from skins, that they used dogs to control, insofar as possible, herds of wild animals, that they traded with other regions, that they painted, that they sculpted, that they participated in primitive rituals, and that they buried their dead. The Neolithic Age, or the New Stone Age, began about 10,000 years ago, roughly coincident with the end of the last major ice age. And at this point, we are dealing with an estimated world population of 5.3 million, up from 125,000 hominids about 1 million years ago. At this point, large herbivores, particularly the woolly mammoth, had begun to disappear from many regions. And this eliminated a major source of meat and created new incentives to expand food supply. This in turn led to the raising of crops and the exploitation of grazing herds. And thus the Neolithic era coincided with the beginnings of agriculture and the domestication of grazing animals. Now, I emphasize that this is early agriculture, and it doesn't correspond to the agricultural revolution, which we're going to see later on. Because these developments depended upon a band remaining stationary in order to cultivate the crops, in order to manage the herds of grazing animals, village life became possible. And this village life had advantages: improved shelter and room to store manufactured products. And farming allowed time to hone skills because there was leisure time between, planting crops and harvesting crops. And you would need to weed crops as well, but there was still intervening time that was available to hone skills such as to create better tools, to create pottery for storing items, and to manufacture better stone tools. And so the domestication of sheep provided wool and led to the invention of weaving, so that you have a lot of improvements going on as a result of this shift to village life. But there were disadvantages too. Groups became much more susceptible to climate change, particularly droughts, and settlement brought increased illness from bad sanitation, from spoiled food, from decayed animal entrails that rather than being sanitarily buried were just sort of left lying about, and so on. And the more concentrated population facilitated the transmission of infectious diseases. So other disadvantages meant that groups were, again, more susceptible to climate change. But these groups were probably still organized in bands, and the bands were still based on extended families. Motives for organized violence, assuming, again, that organized violence occurred during this era, continued to be the same as would have been the case in the Paleolithic era. That is to say, access to food and water, access to sexual partners from other groups, and also an additional motive for conflict may well have been access to arable land. That is to say, land suitable for cultivation, because not all land is suitable for cultivation. And if agriculture becomes significant, then you need to have land on which you can successfully plant crops and grow them to maturity and harvest them for food, and so on. And perhaps this quest for land on which you could cultivate crops became acute enough to generate organized violence to acquire or to defend that kind of land. This era may also have seen the emergence of raiders who, rather than locating their own food, their own meat, their own vegetables, their own fruits, and so on, attacked villages instead and attempted to steal crops, livestock, and other goods. The question remains, however, did early human beings actually engage in organized violence? And this specimen of Neolithic cave art found in South Africa is a kind of litmus test for the layperson. Does it show human beings engaged in some kind of ceremonial activity? Or does it show two groups engaged in armed conflict? And it depends on what you see in the illustration. Obviously, you're dealing with human figures, And obviously they seem to be carrying sticks or spears or something along those kinds of lines. And so what exactly is going on here? Anthropologists, scientists who study human societies and culture and their development, are divided about the essential nature of Stone Age societies. But the dominant view among present-day anthropologists is that Stone Age societies were peaceful. And for an influential manifesto on this viewpoint, I want you to look at the Seville Statement, one of the readings assigned for this week. And the argument that is made by anthropologists is as much political as anything else. Because if people are naturally peaceful, it tends to argue that there is something morally corrupt about the contemporary state system. Whereas if people are naturally warlike, then it tends to argue that the contemporary state's emphasis on armed security is well placed. Now, it must be said that human beings most of the time cooperate. So why do they kill each other, especially in organized ways? Is this natural? Is this somehow a part of human makeup? Or is it a consequence of the ways in which societies have organized themselves? If the former, this suggests that war is inevitable. If the latter, then it's an aberration that can be curtailed or ended. And here are some authors and books that have been influential in discussing this question. The first is by a woman named Margaret Mead, who's one of the most important or most significant cultural anthropologists of the 20th century. She researched the people of American Samoa, went to live with them for a considerable period of time, and in 1928 published a book called Coming of Age in Samoa, which depicted Samoan society as peaceful, idyllic, and living in harmony. And since the Samoans were living in essentially Neolithic conditions, this has been used as an argument to say that Neolithic peoples were essentially peaceful in nature. On the other hand, you have another anthropologist named Hugh Turney High, who published in 1949 a very different book entitled Primitive War, in which he advanced an analysis that was intentionally offensive to his fellow anthropologists. If you read the book, it has a very strongly in-your-face quality to it. Turney High argued that war was, for the most part, universal, and he spent much of his book describing how primitive societies fought. And again, he used the term primitive as opposed to pre-civilized or something more along those kinds of lines. Turney High also argued that only when a society moved from primitive war to what he called true war could a state emerge. And therefore, he saw war as the foundation of a society capable of creating civilization. So, that, as you can imagine, would have been anathema to anthropologists who viewed early humans as essentially peaceful, and would have rejected the idea that organized violence really lay at the heart, at the foundation of the beginnings of civilization. Now, obviously, we have no ability to discover how humans living in the Neolithic era actually behaved, and consequently no way to determine for sure whether they remained at peace. Hang on a second. This is why you always set your cell phone to the silent position or the do not disturb position when you're holding class. And since this doesn't apply to you, since this is not a face-to-face class, I'll have to remember that it applies to me. So I'm sorry for the interruption. Let me start over again. Obviously, we have no ability to discover how human beings living in the Neolithic era actually behaved. And consequently, we have no way to determine for sure whether they remained at peace or engaged in organized war. As an imperfect substitute, anthropologists have looked at present-day societies living in Neolithic conditions. And of prominent interest are the Yanomamo, indigenous people living in the borderlands of Venezuela and Colombia. And if you're interested in learning more about this group, there is a documentary available through the OSU library. There is a direct link that I have included in this module that will give you access to this documentary. It's about 45 minutes long, and you may very well find it of real interest. In any event, a number of anthropologists have interpreted these people as warlike, as this photo of Yanomamo children suggests. Others suggest that this assessment is overblown and misleading, and that in any event, Yanomamo societies have been indirectly but importantly influenced by the more advanced societies that surround them, albeit at a distance of many miles. And so you're not looking at a Neolithic society in any kind of pure form. Other societies whose technologies are essentially Neolithic may be found in other places, such as highland New Guinea. Presumably, these societies resemble Neolithic societies in other ways too. And anthropological study of these societies gives us some of our best windows into what Neolithic warfare was probably like. Though it must be remembered that these are now the world's most militarily backward societies, whereas real Neolithic warfare, if it exists, on the assumption that it existed, was cutting edge. Historian Doyne Dawson argues that primitive war is characterized by tactics but no strategy, and continues by saying that leadership is largely inspirational. Tactics, which is a term that you're going to need to know throughout this course, tactics refers to the techniques used in the employment of weapons. Strategy is a consciously made connection between the desired objective and the means available to achieve it. And the key question can usually be expressed in this way. We wish to obtain a certain objective. How can we best use our available resources in order to do it? Well, the warfare of New Guinea Highlanders is ritualistic rather than strategic. And so, as Dawson says, it has tactics, but it doesn't have a strategy involved with it. This photograph, which was taken around 1960, shows two groups engaged in a formal battle at a set time and a prearranged field of conflict. Now, these conflicts are indeed lethal, although casualties tend to be light. The weapons used are the spear and the bow and arrow. The bowmen attempt to wound and immobilize a foe who can then be killed with a thrown spear or a spear thrust. However, the engagements take place at such a distance from one another that the combatants can usually dodge the incoming arrows and are expected to do so. And hence there are no shields that are used, and the contest is in considerable measure a test of each warrior's ability and skill and agility in eluding the arrows. The warfare in any case has no strategic purpose. Neither side is attempting, for instance, to capture the other's village or to seize their supplies, for example. A final example that can be used to suggest that Neolithic societies made war is this bone bed at Crow Creek, South Dakota, which dates back to 1325 AD and contains the remains of nearly 500 men, women, and children. And from the marks on their bones and their skulls, it's clear that these victims died violently. We can see evidence of skulls being crushed in. We can see dents in the bones that suggest that they were broken by clubs or nicked by spears and so on. So we know that they died violently. We can tell that they were scalped, that they were mutilated, and that they were left exposed for a few months to scavengers before being buried. So because we can also see evidence that scavengers preyed upon the corpses of these individuals. Now, this certainly indicates that indigenous Americans made war during that period, but does it offer any conclusive evidence about whether Neolithic societies made war? And again, the answer is we just don't know. It is a matter of informed guesswork, and to some extent, I think it's a matter of your basic gut reactions, your basic assumptions about the essential nature of human beings, whether you're going to find the dominant view of anthropologists plausible or not. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to introduce you to the thinking of two intellectuals who thought deeply about this question of war before civilization. And these are, in turn, Charles Darwin and Thomas Hobbes, the same Hobbes that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Darwin and Hobbes reached essentially opposite conclusions about war before civilization. They both assumed that the earliest human societies were naturally warlike, and so they agreed with one another on that point. But they had different views of its efficacy in Neolithic societies. Darwin, on the left, who was best known for his theory of evolution, thought that primitive war, or war before civilization, played a significant role in human natural selection. And he devoted a full chapter to it in a book called The Descent of Man, published in 1871. And Darwin argued that war elevated human virtues, not only intelligence, but courage, altruism, and so on. His basic argument was that warriors who survived were probably more intelligent than warriors who did not, and that their success in warfare gave them a status that in turn gave them access to the best prospects for a mate, whereas those who died in war were nonetheless honored by their societies, who protected their mates and their children or held their families in a higher status that gave members of those families the best prospects for a mate. And thus, they were more likely to pass along their genetic inheritance, which Darwin believed included physical courage and a penchant for altruism as elements of that genetic inheritance. Thomas Hobbes was an English political philosopher. Darwin was a 19th century figure. Hobbes goes back to the 17th century. And Hobbes was as I say, an English political philosopher, and he was concerned with the problem of achieving and maintaining a stable government. He was writing in the decades immediately following the English Civil War, a period of tremendous upheaval that called into question how you could create and maintain a stable and lasting government, and what the intellectual basis for that stable and lasting government might be. And in 1660, he published a very famous and important treatise, Leviathan, which contained a thought experiment about man in a state of nature that was an implicit critique of Darwin's optimistic view of the effects of Paleolithic and Neolithic war. And I've included a passage from Hobbes's Leviathan concerning man in a state of nature. It's one of the documents in this week's module. But I also want to read a segment of it to you verbatim, because it's a very famous passage from Leviathan and his comment on a state of nature. And I want to make sure that you get a good detailed image of what this of what his statement about a man in a state of nature was all about. He says, "Whatsoever therefore in the state of nature is consequent to a time of war, state of nature amounts to a time of war. Every man is enemy to every other man. The same consequent to the time wherein men live without any other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." And so, whereas Hugh Turney High would have argued that that the warfare that came out of Neolithic societies was the foundation of civilization, Hobbes would have argued that as long as human beings were in this state of nature, as long as they were in this unorganized or semi-organized state, civilization was absolutely impossible. And so what he postulated was that human beings created a kind of a social contract whereby they ceded their individual power, which was inadequate to protect them from imminent death from a variety of sources and from other human beings. They ceded their individual power into the hands of a leader who possessed all of this power and all of this authority, and created a government that, in Hobbes' view, was once created a lasting government that could not be overthrown, and the creation of this government alone made possible civilization. And so it's worth considering Darwin and Hobbes in connection with modern war. Does war still conceivably play a role in natural selection? If so, does it play a role for good or for ill? And another question would be whether war is in some sense good for civilization. And this was a popular view toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. The idea that war was a great adventure, a war that, an activity that invigorated societies and strengthened them, and that the violent competition of nature, of nation against nation, was somehow a good thing. The First and Second World Wars largely wiped out this particular view, but for a long time, this Darwinist view called social Darwinism played a significant role in shaping the international arena and views about international activities. As for Hobbes, his portrait of humanity in a state of nature is often applied today to the interstate system, which by this analysis consists of international anarchy, in which each country ruthlessly pursues its own self-interest. And even diplomatic and military alliances are a function of self-interest and change as conditions change. And so thus, during the Second World War, for example, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies against Nazi Germany. But soon after the end of that war, became geopolitical rivals who, among other things, threatened one another with nuclear destruction. And so by this analysis, by this Hobbesian analogy, sovereign states are in a situation almost identical to the state of nature that Hobbes postulated was the condition of early human beings. And so ultimately then, the study of war before civilization is useful in terms of understanding the nature of war. It helps, first of all, in understanding the origins of war. And secondly, it helps to inform the question of whether human beings are naturally warlike. And this is an unresolved question that is nevertheless a question very much worth asking, and a question about which any thoughtful student should invest time and energy to try to come to terms with. And then the third thing is that I want you to be familiar with this Hobbesian concept of human beings as being naturally violent in a state of nature. And although simply a thought experiment, this Hobbesian concept of a state of nature has been very influential in the study of international relations. And we're going to see examples of that as time goes on. So that does it for the second of the two presentations for this week. I would like for you to read the Seville Statement, which I talked about earlier in this presentation. I'd also like you to at least skim over the more expanded statement by Thomas Hobbes about human beings in a state of nature. As an option, take a look at that documentary about the Yanomamo peoples of northern South America, and then get ready to participate in a discussion within your group about the questions regarding the nature of war. And then toward the end of the week, you'll have a quiz to confirm your understanding of the most important information presented. So for now, I say goodbye and good luck with the rest of this week and with the early stages of your semester. Stay safe, and insofar as consistent with staying safe, have a good time. Take care.